Welcome to another episode of YD Drives the Future. Today, we're diving into two critical topics: driving practice for novice drivers and distracted driving. Joining us are two incredible guests: Robertson, President and CEO of the Traffic Injury Research Foundation, and Kylie Bowman, Youth Advisor and Program Lead for TIRF.
Road safety is relevant to everyone, and in my lifetime, I've been hit 3 times. Every time I was at a dead stop. So I think it just really brought home the fact that road crashes affect everyone, and many of our staff have been crash involved, as I'm sure many Canadians have.
When I was 8 years old, I was rear-ended by a distracted driver. And at that time, my mom Kylie Bowman, had already started the Drop It and Drive program for about a year. And what happened to me really cemented what my mom was like, why she created Drop It and Drive and how it affects kids. And now I have the privilege to be a part of it.
We often think of distractions as just our phones, but as Kylie and Robin point out, it's much more than that.
Daydreaming is a big one. You can't see it. You can't observe people are doing it. But yet it's a very common thing. As we're driving, we're thinking about other things happening in our life, situations, events, tasks, and that takes your attention off the road. And that split second in which you're distracted can be really, really dangerous, not just for yourself, but for other road users.
From technology in our cars to conversations with our passengers, distractions are everywhere. So how can we stay safer?
Drop everything and focus on the task at hand. Focus on driving, even just talking with your passenger.
In this episode, we'll explore the biggest distractions on the road, how technology both helps and hinders drivers, and what we can do to make our roads safer. We'll also discuss how important dedicated driving practice is to developing safe driving habits.
Focusing on specific skill development and not just generally learning how to drive. And I think that's an important one for parents to understand when they're working with their teens. It's not just drive me to the grocery store and let's see how you do, right? It's having concrete objectives and learning very specific tasks.
Welcome to YD Drives the Future, a podcast where we cover all aspects of driver education and road safety. For over 50 years, Young Drivers of Canada has been dedicated to educating drivers of all skill levels and changing their driving behaviors for the safety of all road users. Let's jump into today's episode. So welcome to another episode of YD Drives the Future. Today, our guests are Robertson, President and CEO of TIRF, which stands for the Traffic Injury Research Foundation, and Kylie Bowman, Youth Advisor and Program Lead for TIRF. Welcome aboard to YD Drives the Future. I'm excited about some of the areas we're going to talk about today.
Yes, thank you for having us. Really excited as well.
Why don't you just give us a little bit of a background? Let's start with you, Kylie. We had a little bit of pre-conversation about the vlog, so I know a little bit about you, but why don't you share with our audience a little bit about you, your background, how you got involved as youth advisor? Tell us a little bit about you.
Of course. So I guess the short of it, I was crash involved when I was 8 years old. I was rear-ended by a distracted driver. And at that time, my mom Kylie Bowman, had already started the Drop It and Drive program for about a year. And what happened to me really cemented what my mom was like, why she created Drop It and Drive and how it affects kids. And she started telling my story to schools when she'd present in corporate groups. And now I have the privilege to be a part of it. And I've also joined them and done presentations to many different schools across Canada and corporate presentations, and I get to be the one to tell my story instead of my mom. So I get to work with her, and I get to work with TIRF. I've also been able to use my art that I've always done. I finally finished my bachelor's degree in visual arts, so I'm very excited. And I've gotten the as well to kind of branch out and work on like the logos and branding and work behind the scenes and really kind of bring my style and my point of view, and I can actually like visually share it with turf and those my age and older, so to give everyone kind of a different point of view of what we're trying our message.
That's great. And just for our audience, Drop It and Drive. Why don't you just give us the Coles and Oates version of what that program is all about?
Yeah, so the drop it and drive, mom didn't really want it to be something specific like the phone or drop alcohol or something like that, because it's everything. Like anything can be a distraction, even like daydreaming. You're not even realizing it's happening, but it's still a distraction too. So drop it, drop everything and focus on the task at hand, focus on driving, even just talking with your passenger. It's been going on since 2010. So we've done many 60,000 youth workshops.
Right. So the goal of that program was basically to take away everything, focus on driving as the task.
Yeah.
Excited to talk more about that and what it could stand for.
Yes.
Robin, how about you? What's your background with turf and how long have you been involved? And
So road safety is relevant to everyone, and in my lifetime, I've been hit 3 times. Every time I was at a dead stop. So I think it just really brought home the fact that road crashes affect everyone, and many of our staff have been crash involved, as I'm sure many Canadians have. I myself am a criminologist. I've been with the organization 25 years, and I started started my career working on the issue of impaired driving. And today, TIRF, as an independent road safety research institute, really focuses on road user behavior across a broad spectrum. And young drivers is obviously a key point of research, as youth are overrepresented in crashes, largely as a result of young age and inexperience. So looking at road crashes among youth has been one of the main topics that we've focused on from a research perspective. And then with the Drop It and Drive program, they came under the umbrella of TIRF. And we like to take our research and turn it into public facing educational focused materials that are digestible and easy to read, to help a broad range of road safety stakeholders, including government, industry, and associations, and local communities affect change. So it's a topic that is really relevant to everyone, and that a lot of our staff are personally invested in doing work to reduce road crashes and making that change to make roads safer for all Canadians.
I've been in the industry for almost 35 years at this point. Started off answering phones and selling people YD courses, and here I am today, 35 years later, having some really interesting conversations with folks that have been in the industry for a very, very long time. Let's dial back to I want to stick right now for drop it and drive. What, in your opinion, is the biggest distraction that current drivers face?
I think the most common one people think about it is cell phones, because you can see it, right? You can see it. You can see people being distracted. It's a physical object that they hold. But the reality is there's a fairly even split between distractions in vehicles and distractions outside of vehicles. If you look at data, again, cell phones are the easiest thing to capture. but a lot of jurisdictions have made improvements in the last decade, and we get a lot more detailed information about the different types of distractions. So to Kylie's point, the daydreaming is a big one. You can't see it. You can't observe when people are doing it. But yet it's a very common thing as we're driving. We're thinking about other things happening in our life, situations, events, tasks, and that takes your attention off the road. And that split second in which you're distracted can be really, really dangerous, not just for yourself, but for other road users.
I wonder how many people have missed an exit or missed a turn and realize, how did I get here? And that's the sort of distraction level that we're talking about, right? Where it's almost like you blank out when you're behind the wheel and you cover seconds or sometimes even minutes of driving time, and you have no idea what's happened in those minutes. Kylie, is there a difference, in your opinion, on the distractions that are predominant in more of a youth culture versus an older driver culture?
Well,
That
like
was a
from
nice way. That was a nice way of saying kids versus old folks.
exactly. From like young enough where like people are just learning how to drive, kids are just starting, the distraction in itself is figuring out how to drive. Because when you, especially what I found when I was learning how to drive, um, I there was so much you have to take into account that as you've driven longer, it's become second nature, like flipping the indicator, checking the rear view mirror, doing a shoulder check, all that stuff, how much pressure to put on the gas and the brake, all becomes second nature. When you're learning how to drive, it's not. You have to consciously think about each individual step it takes to make a left turn. And that in itself is so much. So having patience and like proper training for those learning how to drive is so important.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, everybody says, yeah, let's just make a turn. Well, do you know that there's actually 10 steps to a right-hand turn? And you look at someone, they look at you like you're purple with two horns growing out of your head. But there's actually 10 steps to making a turn. And I get exactly where you're coming from. Um, Now, those are reported causes of distractions. What are some of the other biggies that, are maybe the untalked about distractions? The ones that we don't want to believe are distractions. What about the old, I'm talking to my passengers in the vehicle? And is that any different than talking on a cell phone?
I think the important thing to keep in mind with conversations, whether they're on a phone or with someone in the vehicle, is it's the complexity of the cognitive load. In other words, it's how difficult and complex is the issue that you're talking, how much brain power. If you're talking about budget planning versus if you're going to stop for coffee, those are two very different conversations. So there's the complexity of the conversation that you're having. If it's an emotionally charged conversation that you're having, those are really big ones. And the primary difference, the question that often gets asked is, what's the difference between talking on the phone or talking to someone in your vehicle? The person in your vehicle with you can see the road. They can see the traffic, they can see the hazards, and quite naturally, people stop talking or pause the conversation during particularly complex scenarios, or they're your second pair of eyes. The person on the other end of the phone doesn't see that and just keeps right on talking. So I think I think that's a more challenging one to try and capture.
I've had this conversation with a number of new driver classes over the past few decades, and that was exactly my focus as well. It's look, when you're having a conversation with your passengers and you stop talking, they see exactly what you're trying to pay attention to. So it's easier for them to disengage, let you do the driving, and then come back to it. What about vehicle technology? I mean, nowadays we're dealing with cars that have screens in them. We're dealing with cars that are Wi-Fi equipped. Is that adding to the cognitive load, Robin, that you were talking about?
Yes, yes, it is. So in a perfect world, in ideal circumstances, it can be helpful, but think about the last time you tried to use any piece of technology and it didn't work, or it didn't work correctly, right? So the first thing that you do when the technology doesn't respond the way you want it to is you look at it to try and see what's happening. So I think the potential risk that it adds is something that people probably underestimate. There is an assumption that hands-free is safer, and under certain conditions, it can be. But if it's not working perfectly, or if it's a more complicated task, ultimately what we see in research is drivers end up not looking at the road and instead looking at whatever piece of technology, whether it's your GPS, whether it's your infotainment, whether it's your voice to text, to try and troubleshoot. And that's the last thing you should be doing when you're driving. So there's that. And then there's the additional complexity of a lot of people are not necessarily familiar with the kinds of safety features that they have in their vehicle, and how they react, the kinds of warnings or indicators or responses the vehicle will do. And again, your first instinct when something like that happens is you're looking to see, what does that alarm mean? Why is the steering wheel vibrating? So you're trying to process the information. So I think it has a lot of potential. I think there's a huge educational gap for people to understand when and how those technologies can be useful, and more importantly, what are the limitations of those technologies? Because if there's a perfect technology that exists, I don't think anyone's seen it yet.
No, and I'm thinking about a recent experience for me. I'm just driving a car that's different to the one that I typically drive. And it's like all the buttons, even on the display, are in a different spot. I'm used to going boop and getting the screen that I want, the one that I'm used to. And all of a sudden, it's like, wait a minute, I have to actually pay attention to where my finger is going to push in order to get that screen. And it was a very enlightening experience. Let me
Yeah.
put it that way. Kylie, do you have some info that you'd like to add?
Yes, well, even with the newer models and a lot of the buttons that are normally like had like the button to skip a song or pause, play, it's not a tactile button that you can feel. It's on a flat screen, so you actually have to take the time to look over at it to press the button, which is something you don't want to take your eyes off the road. So having that in mind and kind of just accepting that if you made a terrible playlist, you're going to have to just accept it until you can pull over.
Okay, I'm going to show my age here. I didn't even know that there was such a thing to skip a song. It's like whatever comes on, that's what I get. And it's like, just wait the 2 or 3 minutes till it's over. So I must be either extremely patient or so not into the skipping part of things. What about for navigation? Do you think that there's any positives that have come out of, um, navigation systems? I mean, I think about, the old days where the map was like, 4 by 8 feet and the writing was about 1 micron big. Are there advantages to a navigation system versus, old fashioned giant paper things that blocked our view?
Certainly, particularly when you're going to new areas, either new parts of the community which you live, roads you've not driven on, and if you have to make a left-hand turn lane, knowing if it's one left-hand turn lane, a dedicated lane, if it's 2 lanes, it gives you some advanced knowledge in terms of what the road's going to look like. There are some cues there to tell you what the road's going to look like. And then, of course, if you're going someplace new, just providing you with those step-by-step directions. I think the risk with navigation systems could be when you figure out you've either entered your destination wrong, you forgot to enter your destination at all, or it can't make sense of the audio instructions, and you're trying to look at the screen to figure out. So again, a great technology, very helpful. And I know there are at least some people who couldn't go in their own city anywhere if they didn't use their Jeep, even if they've lived there forever. I mean, I'd like
I
you of old
know, I
school
know.
where you learn your roads, you learn the direction of the roads, you identify landmarks so you can navigate yourself without GPS. But I think for a lot of not just teens, but adults, they've just become over
Yep.
reliant on GPS to get them.
And so that part of their brain that deals with remembering how to get from point A to point B is it doesn't never develops. I was actually thinking about a car rental, like you rent a car
Yep.
at the airport because you've gone to a travel destination, and okay, look, you know what, I drive a Toyota, and I'm in a Toyota, so this should all be great. And boop boop boop, you enter your destination and you drive out of the parking lot, and the person is speaking
Yep.
Spanish, and it's like, oh
Yeah.
darn, I agree that, I think so much of this technology has made driving technically
Yep.
easier in some respects, but it's almost like education on how to integrate technology into your driving to get the maximum benefit without the gigantic negatives that are also associated. Is It's almost like, a sidebar course for drivers or even new drivers. Kylie, what do you think about that? How to use the technology that's in your car to its advantage as opposed to it being a pain in the behind.
Yeah, well, I think taking the time to, especially if you're just learning how to drive or you popped into a new vehicle that you've rented, all of that, or you're driving your friends, whatever you're driving, taking the time to sit in the driveway and just figure out your vehicle rather than going in and assuming that you got this and you'll just figure it out on the road. You don't you don't want to do that. That's not something you want to do. You want to take the time to like at least get a visual on like the important things. This is how I turn on the headlights. This is how I adjust my seat heater. This is like, just
Yep.
take a look, adjust your mirrors beforehand. The number of people that just hop into the car and then don't adjust the mirrors from like the last person that's driven it. And then you're sitting in the road trying to wedge and figure out how to move the side mirrors. It's like just
Yep.
take a moment, look at
Yep.
your car, figure it out. Don't figure it out on the road.
So this is a nice this is a listen, I think we're all on the same page here that driving is a job. It requires 100% of your attention when you're behind the wheel. Casual conversation is great, but let's not talk about next year's budget or the intricate details of building a 95-story building while we're also trying to operate a vehicle. I think that, we're all on the same wavelength, and young drivers has believed in the focus on driving, for the last 53 years. Let's do a little segue since we were talking about, education and self-educating on technology. And the report that I have on driver education, there were a couple of things in there that were a bit eye-opening for me. And Robin, one of the sections of that report that was really interesting to me was the section that you called deliberate practice, or sorry, that the report writer referred to as deliberate practice. And it made it seem like it wasn't just hopping in the car and driving from point A to B. Can you maybe give us your take on what deliberate practice is and how important it is in the whole learning to drive environment?
Sure. So deliberate practice is being much more concrete in learning tasks, right? And you're aiming to learn specific things. So driving a car, back to your point, there's a lot of steps, right? 10 steps to make a right-hand turn. Deliberate practice is when you're learning to drive, practicing with the intention of learning specific goals, and focusing in on what's going to help you learn those specific goals. So learning to drive is very broad, right? And general, and means a lot of different things. There's a lot of elements to driving. So certainly for teens when they're practicing, and I'm sure as what you do in coursework, being very specific and concrete about the tasks and the steps in achieving a specific goal or skill. So really focusing on specific skill development and not just generally learning how to drive. And I think that's an important one for parents to understand when they're working with their teens. It's not just drive me to the grocery store and let's see how you do, right? It's having concrete
Mhm.
objectives and learning very specific tasks.
A lot, and I'm not gonna say everyone, but I think that a lot of parents believe that that drive to the grocery store is driving practice. And listen, any butt in the
Yeah,
seat time
is good.
is experiential, right? But driving to the grocery store isn't going to help you with doing right turns at traffic lights if there's no right turns at traffic lights on the way to the
Right.
grocery store,
Right.
right? And this sort of leads into the whole discussion that's been happening quite a lot about parental involvement, parental or guardian involvement in the learning to drive process, and the statistics with regards to collisions, post licensing for those drivers that had parental involvement or guardian involvement versus those that
Yeah.
didn't. Robin, take us in that direction and fill in our audience about that topic.
Right. So the quality and quantity of parental involvement really determines how um, skilled your teen's going to be as they learn to drive. So there's a couple of things for parents to understand. One is your young person is learning from you how to drive from a very, very young age, assuming they're not buried in their phone and learning nothing. But there's certainly research showing that if the parent speeds, doesn't wear their seatbelt, uses their phone while driving, you've got a pretty high likelihood your young person is going to do that when they learn to drive. So helping parents understand, do as I say, not as I do, is not good enough.
Hmm.
Absolutely. And I know Kylie had a lot of hands-on experience with Karen and with her husband, Daryl, from a very young age, and so did Connor, in terms of the quality of driving and pointing out why you're doing certain things and why you don't do certain things and hazards you see on the road. And we know that the number of hours that parents spend also directly correlates with how crash involved your teen's going to be. If you spend more hours and more quality time, and a lot of licensing authorities as well as driving schools will provide a parent handbook or classes for parents to help them understand their role in teaching their teen to drive. We know that more is better, and the research supports that.
Now, I mean, just going back to parental involvement, Young Drivers has run a co-driver program for decades. And gosh, I can remember running them in person where you'd bring up the big coffee urn and you'd stop at the local donut place and you'd have snacks and coffee, and would invite 83 families because that's the number of students that started since your last co-driver session, and 4 would
Yeah.
show up. And the 4 were not the 4 that needed to be there. Those were the 4 that were going to be involved anyway, right? And how what do we do to get the message out that learning to drive isn't just the new driver. It's almost a familial, um I don't want to say responsibility, but it's a familial, everybody in the family gets involved in the new driver's progress. Like, how do we get that message out?
So I think it's hard. It's hard to do simply because families are busier. Often cases, both parents work. So trying to
Mhm.
find the time to do it. I think as teens begin to learn to drive, that needs to be a family conversation in terms of what that entails. And perhaps an enrollment component, if they're taking driver education of some sort, needs to be that upfront conversation of what's involved for parents, and just helping them understand if they're not involved,
Mhm.
then that dramatically limits the hours and experience that teens going to get as they learn to drive. And the less, I mean, experience is one of the factors that is responsible for a reduction in crashes from when they first learn to drive to 12 months, 6 months. 18 months in, their crash risk goes down dramatically as a function of their experience. And if they're not getting that
Right.
experience, there's, a much greater likelihood their teen will be crash involved. So I guess maybe boiling it down to that point is, if you're not spending the time, you're increasing your teen's risk of being crash involved.
Mhm.
Might be a more concrete way to help them understand.
Mhm.
Well, I mean,
Mhm.
it's also if it's a familial thing because each person in the family isn't driving separately. You guys are going to be together in a vehicle. If you failed to teach your kid proper safe driving techniques, at some point your kid will be driving you somewhere because you need to get somewhere and they're like, "Oh yeah, I'll take you." And if they can't drive, what can happen behind the wheel can also like it will impact you as well. So,
Right.
like from an entirely selfish point of view, to also keep the yourself,
Self-preservation, is that what you're
yeah,
talking about, Kylie?
yeah,
Yeah.
self-preservation, keeping those you love safe, also, like, the way you drive can
Mhm.
impact those you care and love about and your passengers and all that. So that's also why I wanted to make sure I really knew how to drive, because I knew I wouldn't
Mhm.
just be driving by myself all the time. I would have
Right.
passengers, I would have other people in the car. So really knowing what you're doing and being confident enough if your passenger is talking to you and you're like, "Can you just please stop? I gotta focus." Like being
Yep.
confident and knowing what you're doing and being okay with saying, "You know what? I don't know how to do this. Can you teach me how to do this? I don't feel confident merging. Can we have more practice?" Like you
Yeah.
want to be confident for those around you and yourself.
Well, I even think about driving situations, even now, and I'm old and I've been on the road a long time, and when I'm driving in an unfamiliar area, sometimes just the sight lines are just not good. And I can remember saying to a passenger, can you just check to make sure that it's okay for me to pull out? I can't actually see really great from the angle that I'm at this particular, side street. And, it became, it wasn't a, what do you mean you can't see? You're the driving professional. It was, yeah, yeah, for sure. I'll help you out, and having the confidence to do that. But back to you, Robin, for just a second. When we talk about this deliberate practice, different jurisdictions call it different things: guided practice, suggested practice, and they've put a number of hours on it. I think in British Columbia, it's 60 hours of outside practice. Where do you think the right number is? What's the right number? I mean, a million is probably, excessive, but and I know that the right number is the more is better, but where do you get the maximum benefit from the deliberate
Well,
practice?
think about, let's boil it down to basic terms. If you're learning to play piano, right? And
Mhm.
play a song on the piano, how many times, how many hours do you think you need to spend to do that? Right? And that's a very low risk task. You're probably not going to injure yourself playing the piano.
Mhm.
Generally, what we see
Right.
from research and what we see in jurisdictions like Australia, which tend to have been on the forefront of innovation, is it's 80 to 120 hours is really
Okay.
the optimal recommended um, uh, range for practice. So the reality is, the more you practice, the better you're going to be. And one of the most essential reasons for young people to learn to practice, and to practice not just in a driver education setting, but with their parents on a day-to-day basis, is the hardest thing for young people to do is recognize hazards, to anticipate hazards, and to be able to mitigate hazards. Their hazard perception skills are really the last to develop. And the way you develop hazard perception skills is with practice, driving on all different kinds of roads at all different kinds of days, time of day in all different seasons to learn to recognize the car backing out, the heavy truck making a turn and going wide, the lane change that was not signaled, the distracted driver who's slowing down in front of you because they're distracted. And that's what distracted drivers do, is they try and slow down even in high-speed traffic. Without experience, you are not able to
Yep.
recognize, right, and anticipate. And that's the most important reason for the number of hours of practice and experience behind the wheel.
It's also the upkeep of the practice. Like, for going for the piano metaphor, I played piano for 5 years and I can play nothing now. So just because you did it and you've done it before years ago doesn't
Yep.
mean it's not something that you have to keep practicing and keep doing. Like, you can lose those skills if you don't use them.
So the learning curve is one direction and the forgetting curve is the other direction. And typically the forgetting curve is a much sharper downward curve than the learning curve, right? We learn more gradually than we forget.
And the road environment,
Also,
sorry, the
So-
road environment is different every day. You drive the same road, but it's different every day.
Yeah.
And I think that's what people need to understand. You can't just assume your trip to the grocery store, your trip to school, or your trip to your employers is going to be the same today as it was yesterday, because it's not.
No, for sure. I mean, I agree that that's a very interesting statement. Now, since experience is often acquired through driver education, one of the other interesting tidbits that I read in the report was that 10 hours was, and I think the words that were used was the sweet spot. And I have to tell you that after 35 years, I always thought the right thing was more hours in car, more hours with a driving instructor. Maybe Robin, you can elaborate a little bit on where that section of the report was going.
Honestly, no. I'd have to go back and look at the report. I was
Oh,
involved
okay.
in drafting it. I thought we
Okay.
were going to have a little bit of a different focus.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Well,
I'd have
why
to
don't
go
we
back
just
and look at it to see.
from your perspective, 10 hours of guided education, and that's really what driver education is, to me doesn't seem like a lot. How does that fare with other countries?
For on road, it's probably comparable in Western countries. In terms of it, generally it's driver education is about 30 hours. Some are more.
Right.
The 10 hours on road is probably comparable in a lot of like Canadian, US jurisdictions. I'd say that's low for like places that are more progressive, like Australia, where they've really is a strong focus on young drivers, and they've done a lot of research in supporting how people learn to drive. I think there's research in North America suggesting 10 hours isn't enough. But I don't think programs have adapted to that. And I think another important reason for why parental involvement is so high. Like, Kylie, you spent so many hours with your mom and your dad learning to drive.
Yeah, like, and especially both having different, like, mom's driving style is different than dad's driving style. So it's also important for both guardians, parents, whoever, if you have more than one that's going to be teaching you how to drive, them also communicating is important. Because if one parent is teaching a kid one thing and how to, like, I don't know, do a proper shoulder check or how to do, like, a technique, and then the other parent teaches them something entirely different, or a different, like, this is how I do it, this is my secret trick on driving, it's going to be very confusing for the kid. So whoever is going to be driving with the learner, having them talk and discuss what they have taught the kid, all that important stuff. And again, it brings it back to it being a familial thing,
Right.
having someone learn how to drive in the family. It isn't as segregated as some people may feel that it is.
Right.
It's really like it bleeds out everywhere. It affects anyone in the car, near the car, people around the
Yeah.
car. Like it's not just you and your vehicle. There's other people in vehicles on the road. There's people walking on the road. So it really is not just a solo expedition. It is a big thing.
Kylie, did that happen to you that you got some different feedback from mom co-driver versus dad co-driver?
Once or twice with some little things.
Yeah.
Because also there was mom, dad, grandparents. What I learned in the new driver young and new, your program, and
Right.
what I learned in that extra little small business program. So I had so
Right.
many different techniques going back and
Yeah.
forth. And I did
Yeah.
end up, we all talked about exactly what I learned, what is safe. And that's also what becomes so important for the adults to keep learning the new things, the new bits
Right.
and pieces
Right.
about driving, like even the newer law about cell phones and what is allowed.
Right.
Like all these bits and pieces, you have to constantly keep updating so that everyone around
Mhm.
you can remain safe and in the know.
Mhm. I mean, the end that I'm at is often teaching techniques in the young drivers program would conflict with, the driving style. That's a good way of putting it with the parents and co-drivers at home. And one of the things that we do is, we focus on the ability to avoid being rear-ended. And you can't prevent them all, but if you do a few simple things, you can certainly reduce your risk by a whole lot. And one of them is just knowing what's going on behind you. And I can think back to, you know, my dad as my co-driver many moons ago before YD was even available in my area. And my dad yelling at me going, "Never mind what's behind you. It's what's ahead of you that's important." And it's tough because that would have been a big conflict, sort of in today's world where knowing what's going on around you 360 degrees is so important. So I like the idea of streamlining the message, making sure that everybody's on the same page. Listen, everybody has their tip for how to do a parallel park. And Kylie, your way of doing a parallel park may be different than my way of doing a parallel park, but I don't think there's been too many fatalities involved in the skill of parallel parking. And those are the kind of places where sometimes the tips and the shortcuts can actually be very helpful to a new driver,
Oh,
as opposed to as opposed to, okay, well, no, don't wait there when the light, do this, and no, you don't have to look there. That when the light changes, just do this, and it's contrary to all of the safety messages that we're trying to instill.
yeah, there's always a time for tips and tricks for little stuff. This is the line of sight I use to pull into my driveway, and this is how I get it perfect every time. Like there's always that little bits and pieces, but when it comes to
Mhm.
safety, like how to properly merge, how to do a left with the advanced green arrow, like all that kind of stuff is not really where you want to be putting your own style into it. You want to be educated and know how to properly do this and how to properly teach who you are teaching how to drive to do this.
Do I think about the word repetition and Kylie, I'm gonna draw on your youth. Do do younger folks get tired of hearing the same message from their co-driver all the time? Slow down, pay attention, slow down, pay attention. Like does sometimes the instructions that could be very, very important get tuned out because they happen too often?
It can definitely happen. I find that to kind of keep it interesting, maybe change up your phrasing a few
Okay.
bits and pieces to keep it interesting, but it never hurts to say it more often. Like if it is because of a safety reason, keep saying it. And also like don't just assume that they just know. I recently had an acquaintance. They crashed their car because they were driving too fast in the rain, and their friends in the
Mhm,
back weren't wearing their seatbelts. Everyone survived. They are okay. But the
mhm.
basics of just wearing your seatbelt is, just goes right over their head. So there's nothing you can really say too often when it comes to safety. Never just assume that they know because obviously they know. they know, but are they going to actually do it? So it doesn't hurt to just keep saying it, keep reminding, come up with different ways of throwing it in and saying it, whatever you need to do, but you can't say it too often.
Robin said earlier that one of the skills that new drivers lack is the ability to identify a hazard. And Kylie, I'm just going to ask you maybe for a personal experience that you might be able to draw from. Was there a time when, you were behind the wheel, you were with a co-driver and you, for whatever reason, zoned out on a particular hazard that your co-driver thought was too important to ignore? How did your co-driver step in without um, escalating the emotion in your car?
I think it's focusing on the, I guess, body language of vehicles, the tires turning. So I was going down
Okay.
a street and someone was parked on the side of the road and didn't indicate that they were going to pull out and drive in front. So I was still learning how to drive, so everything was a lot. And I didn't see the tires begin to turn on their vehicle and start giving that
Mhm.
body language that they're going to pull out. And my passenger was like, hey, just slow down, stop. And there's usually, if you get like short, concise phrases, like
Mhm.
it to discuss with each other and confirm, like as the passenger, when you are learning how to drive, when I say stop, whatever you are doing, I need you to hit the brake. Be very specific. There's got to be certain stuff that you just decide beforehand. I'll say left or I say check right. Like keep it very concise. Just sitting
Mhm.
beside you and making a noise like whoa, that doesn't help me. That doesn't tell me what's going on. Doesn't tell me what I need to look out for. Give me
Yeah.
a specific phrase that I can do.
And I think that I like that. I like the idea of, sort of having that relationship between the co-driver and the new driver, that listen, if I say this, like, let's act first and we'll talk later, sort of an idea. Did you find that your co-driver interfered too much in the beginning?
Yeah, I can sort of. Sometimes when you're learning how to drive initially, you're like, "Oh my god, I have no idea what I'm doing. Everything is so new." But then you hit like a certain phase of now I know what I'm doing. I've been doing this for a whole year now, so don't worry about it. I know what I'm doing.
I
And
I got you.
you can kind of feel like they're they're not helping or they've made the situation worse, and it's like no, I totally saw that, of course I knew. It's like just because you saw it doesn't mean you are making the correct maneuver to avoid it. So
Right.
it's getting
Right.
over that hump, and it usually comes with your co-driver just always being aware. Like don't feel bad for pointing out something,
Right.
because and then the driver's like, oh my god, I totally saw it, how could you think that I didn't see it? It's like it doesn't hurt to say it. Doesn't hurt to point it out,
Right.
especially if you point it out in a calm, concise way. If you just make a weird noise,
Right.
that doesn't help. That makes
Right.
it
Right.
entirely worse. And that it's frustrating if that's the case. So having and also when you're a co-passenger, understanding like where your limitations are. If you are really stressed out and uncomfortable with like teaching a new driver, then maybe you're not it. This is when you get the other guardian involved, or it's where
Right.
you go into a driver licensing program and have
Right.
a professional deal with it. If you are really not comfortable, that's just going to make the entire situation so much more stressful than it needs to
Stressful for
be.
everybody involved.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
understand limitations on all ends.
Listen, this has been a fabulous conversation. We've gone in so many different directions, everything from um, parental involvement to, what is the distraction. And I'd like to sort of end our hour going back to distracted driving, and when do we start talking about distractions? I mean, is it elementary school? Is it, the junior grades? Is it, when they get a G1 or a learner's license in your province? Like, when do we have to start the conversation about how important distraction-free driving is?
I would suggest at a very young age. I know Karen and Kylie have delivered the Drop It and Drive program in an elementary school setting, and you have very young passengers in vehicles. When you ask them how many of them have been a passenger, with a guardian, a parent, a grandparent, a family friend, and they've done something distracting, and we see a growing number of hands go up. And I know for Karen and Kylie, one of the most important reasons for reaching young people is they don't have a filter, right? They'll tell you the hard, unvarnished truth in a way that resonates, whether you want to hear it or not. Uh, so I think
Yep.
teaching them at a young age, particularly knowing that kids learn from their parents at a very young age, that's the time to start having that conversation long before they get behind the wheel, not just so they become good drivers, but they also learn and are empowered to speak up as passengers.
And to learn how
I
to
like
be
that.
safe passengers. Like as soon as the kid is in the car and they can start to understand like basic interaction, having like a talk with the kid, even like at their level, very basic. But if you are screaming and kicking the back of mom's seat, you are the distraction. So please
Right.
restrain yourself, keep it together, and we can figure it out when we get home. That's
Right. Right. It'll be interesting to see what the next 20 years of new drivers is going to look like with the more conversations about distraction, more conversations about proper education as technology increases. Are we going to be a society of passengers in driverless cars that couldn't help themselves, get out of a jam if needed? I mean, it's interesting what the future is going to look like. Um, Kylie and Robin, it's been great chatting with you today. Robin, do you have anything you'd like to add as we close out our session today?
Just how important it is for parents to understand how their teens learn to drive, what they need to learn to drive safely, and to be active in the process. And we have a range of resources, either through our Drop and Drive program, through our Young and New Driver Resource Center, to really help parents understand their role in that process. Young people are going to be lifetime drivers, right? So let's give them the foundation to start with to ensure that they're safe throughout their life as they learn to drive.
I like it. Kylie, what about you? What message do you have for our audience as a final takeaway?
that you can never learn too much. You can't be too safe when it comes to this stuff. Always keep learning. You will never be the best at driving. There's always ways to improve, and it's okay to admit that.
I like it. And from our conversation, my takeaway is going to be that more is better in terms of exposure to different driving situations, and that technology can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing if it's not used correctly. Thanks again to Robin Robertson, the president and CEO of the Traffic Injury Research Foundation, and Kylie Bowman, youth advisor and program lead. It has been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today, and let's get back together again and take some of these topics in a new and unique direction.
Great. Thank you so much for having us. It's been really informative for all of us, I think.